The game can noticeably lag, drop frames per second, when Colette is in the party.
It's an issue with the upscale modifier and the angel wings, so the effects of their characters. Colette has them out permanently in data, so it becomes easier to just remove her to get a more stable
and well-tested way of reducing
What the heck?
FPS drops
Did they
in battle.
play test this game?
Yes, I know I'm beating a dead horse here. Let's talk about something else for a change.
Goldeneye. Load a rumble pack and see how it feels when 007 meets N64.
Goldeneye is a bizarre case study in the realm of retro. What started as a cute licensed virtual cop alike with the Bond license became the go-to template for FPS on consoles, and what could only be described as one of the happiest accidents in multiplayer gaming. And in its wake, it's left a legacy of misguided sequels and remakes, a licensing nightmare, and a textbook example of the troubles when it comes to games preservation. Not for a lack of trying, but the modern releases of GoldenEye still feel like they're missing something. So, how did we get to this point? And of all the ports and back alley distributions of this game, which one should you play?
Forget about it. I'm just going home.
If you're just tuning in to this irritating corner, hi, I'm Seong, your average hyperfixating gamer, and this is the strange and almost tragic rabbit hole of GoldenEye and its quest for identity. Made several months after everyone else has already talked about it. Because the fuck's an algorithm. Let's take a trip back in time, to an era before the internet, when Y2K was primed to end the world, and a new team at Rare was, unbeknownst to them, about to make history with a small little license project they had in mind. The GoldenEye, as we know it today, wasn't even a blip in Rare's eyes, as they were envisioning the role of Bond as something more akin to a cop, a virtual cop. Using the mind-blowing technology of the
Silicon graphics computers
to lay down this 3D landscape, the idea was to have the player on a set path, tasked only with shooting whatever nondescript bad guys committed the terrible crime of getting in your way. Originally, the one thing setting this project apart from its inspiration was having enemies act with a level of pseudo-intelligence, free to move about the screen from their designated spawns, rather than standing in single file like all of the dopes in the arcade realm. And you know, the more I hear about this, the more I think less of Virtual Cop and more of the Super Spy. I can't be the only one that sees this, right? Anyone? Just me? But inspiration really struck by pulling the camera off the rails and letting Bond explore the levels at his own pace. It sounds like an obvious epiphany today, but keep in mind that this was the 90s. The concept of the first-person shooter didn't even exist yet, as everyone saw it fit to call any game with a first-person camera a Doom clone. If you think games have it tough now with being compared to Dark Souls for the simple concept of having challenge, gamers 30 years ago were even more dense. And this was pretty much the status quo of the time. If you really think about it, games today take inspiration from GoldenEye, and the premise of this game was taking inspiration from a Japanese coffee commercial. Knowing how impulsive game development was at the time, I guess having a 3D battle system without three-dimensional movement makes a lot more sense to me now. Well, regardless of whatever caffeinated or alcoholic beverages were at play here, GoldenEye on N64 turned out to be a massive hit. And while I've had my share of hot takes before, I'm siding with the choir on this one. It's fun as fuck, no matter what the Georges of the world might say.
And frankly, we don't care about the multiplayer stuff. No one buys a game specifically for multiplayer options.
So, that hasn't aged well. At all. 007's N64 outing sets itself apart from the Quakes of the world by making every level its own sandbox, making exploration more than just finding secrets, but almost an outright requirement in GE's objectives-based design. The Rare Rascals emphasize making every stage feel like real locations in this little 64-bit world. which is a feat that only Duke 3D managed to pull off before this. It's laughable to think that any of these cardboard paintovers was ever considered immersive, but you also have to consider that many of the N64's other heavy hitters were more about sprawling fantasy worlds, or video game obstacle course design that doesn't even try to make sense. Meanwhile, GE has things like innocuous houses with exploding bookshelves, and dead ends in the level design are contextualized in the environment to give an impression that there's more to these stages than just rushing from point A to B. There's things like distinct landmarks that set some of these places apart, mostly, and this design lends itself perfectly to speedrunning. There's always a time to beat on each stage, so you're encouraged to explore and scope things out on a first run, figuring out which objectives to go for first, and which abandoned houses are red herrings. Goldeneye is one of the few games I've gone out of my way to speedrun, and it even rewards your efforts with the extensive page of cheats to unlock. Though some of these times are almost impossible on 00 Agent, and my god, some of these objectives feels like pure RNG. Facility was bad, sure. Your odds of success hangs entirely on a random doke generator. Aztec was worse, just because of how accurate the AR and Moonraker lasers are relative to everything else in the game. But Archives? 00 Agent in 1 minute 20 while escorting Natalia and protecting
Mishkin
at the same time without aggroing them? I've played a lot of games, I thought I'd seen it all, but this?
I'm scared. I'm getting out of here.
Do you need the black box?
I'm scared. I'm getting out of here. Jane, I'm scared. I'm getting out of here.
Stop!
Yes, it proves that Jaws was involved in the Sever riot and you're dead. Even trusted friends are capable of betrayal.
I'm scared. I'm getting out of here.
A costly lesson.
Yes, it proves.
I'm scared. I'm getting.
Do you need
Yes, it proves that Jaws was involved in the Sever.
it is in the safe. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Natalia, we're f***ing leaving!
Jesus! Literally just made it by the skin of my fucking teeth here. Could you cut it any closer than that? Show of hands at whoever failed 00 Agent Train because of Natalia dying at the last possible minute. This shit almost framed perfect. I guess that's the other half of everything he alluded to. At the same time though, set pieces like that are legitimately heart-racing, no matter how jank it feels. There's a certain elegance to Goldeneye's design. The way the gunplay plays it fast and loose about little baby conventions like precision and recoil. Throw out all of that espionage and dual-wield rocket launchers. Who cares if it's impractical if it gets results? It really makes you feel like Goldeneye. Hi, I'm a PSA, and I'm just here to have a little chat concerning a crisis that's impacting our community. And no, it's not time. Now, we might have all our fun cheating with our retro games that we totally legally own on our real 4K hardware. But many secret agents with stretchy arms and oversized craniums have fallen victim to one of MI6's greatest threats yet. Dummies. At least one in every 333,287,557 people have lost their world record runs to irresponsible cheating. Like this numbnut. What was he even thinking? And so we ask you, fellow gamers, to please help practice safe cheating in our community. Cheat responsibly. And that isn't even to speak of the multiplayer, one that I've never gotten to experience myself, but has always looked like a blast. While Perfect Dark might be the objectively better and more polished game between these two, Goldeneye gets away with its simpler design and sheer charm, and is much easier to jump into and play. The Bond's Quake to Joanna's Quake 2. They're both worth playing for their own reasons. But actually getting around to playing these games is where things get muddy. Goldeneye, for all of its innovation and timeless design, at the end of the day was still a licensed game. Rumors were circulating that the British lads at Rare may or may not have been planning on making a successor to Goldeneye using the Bond license, but it was the electronic artists that took hold of the 007 brand in the video game sphere. It's a shame then that they were focused entirely on chasing after Goldeneye's legacy, thinking that Jimmy James was all they needed to sell. But 2000's Perfect Dark all but proves that you don't need a big name like Bond to sell, because people, at least at the time, just want a good game. Granted, this EA era did bring with it some interesting ideas, like that weird stint into combat racing. I've never played it, but what few I've heard about it sounds promising.
For $1, I really did not expect that much. I expected a bit of 007 racing, and instead it's like a really poorly produced remake of V8 Vigilante or something.
Never mind.
Is DK Oldies a scam? No.
The PS2 and Xbox generation was where EA finally got their heads worked out, which brought us 007 Nightfire and Everything or Nothing. Compared to the games before under EA's tenure, these are actually good games that stand tall on their own, but all these later entries still feel like they're hiding beneath the legacy that GoldenEye set for them. They even tried their hand at capitalizing on the name of GoldenEye itself, with a game that has barely anything to do with James Bond or GoldenEye the movie, but was about some guy with a golden eye. But we still never got a real successor to GoldenEye since. I mean, Perfect Dark did get a sequel, prequel on the 360. It wasn't a very good sequel, and general reception of the era would lead someone to believe that the rare magic had all but vanished in the 7th console generation. Bond games were relegated exclusively to generic shooty-bang adventures once Activision bought the 007 license. And even the second big attempt at a GoldenEye reboot was literally a Call of Duty game in disguise, yet still tried to bank on people's nostalgia for that original game to boost sales. Kinda like a certain other company. It stands out even more in retrospect, since the retro renaissance was relevant more than ever with the introduction of the Virtual Console. And if the Wii was capable of emulating N64, then why can't GoldenEye be brought back? Well, the story of GE's licensing hell is probably as well known and documented as the game itself at this point. But this tweet right here sums it up pretty well. They could have, in theory, gotten the game running on a modern console as far back as the Wii, but then who would you go to for the rights to re-release it? For Nintendo's first-party games, they obviously own their own IPs, so it's just a matter of whether they wanted to bring a game to the Virtual Console. And the same applies to someone like Treasure or whether they want to make their own ports in-house or outsource the work to another developer. If it's your typical third-party game, then all it takes is approaching that company and making a deal to port it to whatever platform you have in mind. Which is how we were able to get Sin and Punishment after it languishing in Japanese exclusivity for like 12 years.
Good morning,
Mr. Freeman.
But GoldenEye isn't just any other game. It's a second-party licensed game, one that's more than just video games. GE itself is purportedly based on the movie of the same name, published by MGM and produced by Eon, who themselves are loaned the rights to the James Bond name by its original creator. Though it's worth noting that Fleming Productions disavows all rights to anything regarding the Bond films, so we can ignore this for now. The game itself was a first-party published Nintendo title and developed by Rare, who infamously was bought out by Microsoft following the N64 era. Since GoldenEye's N64 release, the rights for Bond games were sold to EA, then subsequently shuffled to Activision. And if it was just as simple as the game license holder loaning the rights for a game however they pleased, perhaps the story could have ended there. But the Bond license holders are also overwhelmingly protective of the portrayal of their brand, holding executive control over basically all aspects of how even an original Bond game is developed. The Quantum of Solace game alone revealed a lot about the internal strife of making a Bond game to the studio's liking, going as far as writing a Bible about things you can or can't do in James's world, like having homeless people, even as environmental props, because apparently
the Bond universe has no homeless people.
So even if Activision genuinely wanted to make the original GoldenEye available on something like the Virtual Console, implying Activision actually does something good in the gaming industry, which they obviously wouldn't dream of doing, but I'm trying to pretend here for the sake of argument, just let a song dream, goddammit! they still have to go through Micro Bill Gates Soft, who handles all the executive decisions for anything involving Rare, who actually made the original. And Eon/MGM also has to give the okay on an old game that doesn't reflect the current state of the Bond universe. Stop crying. It only gets worse. On the other hand, if they wanted to release on Xbox Live or something, that means they would have to go through Nintendo of all companies to lend the rights to a game they published on their console. And if you're only just joining us, hi, I'm Seong, your average hyperfixating historian, and Nintendo were overprotective about their IPs back then too. With all of that laid out, it's easier to see why they would rather just make a new game from the ground up using the Goldeneye name without actually carrying the baggage that comes with the Goldeneye game, which also explains why the Craig was superimposed into Brosnan's role, as it's basically reimagining what the film would have been like if it was made today. Well, today, nearly 13 years ago, but you get the point. GoldenEye 2010, or GoldenEye Reloaded, whatever you want to call it, was at least a valiant effort, with the Wii's multiplayer gaining its own cult following to this day. But it's still depressing to think that the game that paved its own road for FPS design in 1997 became just another first-person shooter in a market already dominated by games aiming to be the Call of Duty killer. And the less said about whatever the 007 Legends is, the better. So, cue my surprise in September of 2022, when GoldenEye was revealed to be coming to the Switch and Xbox platforms. And not just another pale imitation banking on the nostalgia, but the original game was finally seeing a re-release on modern platforms. Kind of. Then again, it's hard to remember exactly, since I was also... GoldenEye on Switch is just a high-profile addition to the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pass, while the Xbox version would get its own digital release. Sorta, kinda, but not really part of the Rare Replay collection. I say sort of because I got the impression that this was going to become a part of Rare Replay, since they made it a point to say it was free to existing owners of that collection. But was it just an update to it that adds GoldenEye, or was it its own thing? Turns out the answer was... yes. Even though the Xbox release was being made by Code Mystics, the same team that handled all of the N64, NES, and arcade emulation in that collection, it's considered its own standalone product. And just to add to the needless confusion, it was only being given away to owners of the digital release of the Rare Replay exclusively, apparently due to some licensing mishap, which definitely sucks for people who bought the physical collection, seeing as retro games tends to be the ones people have the most sentimental value for, and would want a physical representation of those memories, but if GoldenEye was going to come out by any means, I guess I still prefer this to the NSO approach. Regardless, the simultaneous releases of GE are interesting case studies since both platforms are relying on emulation, and the ways these two went about it showcases pretty radical differences in philosophy when it comes to game preservation. Stuffy words aside, what does any of this actually mean? Let's start first with the one that's by far the most fascinating to me personally, and not always for the right reasons. The N64 NSO experience is, to put it mildly, a mixed bag. And I'm not just saying that because I disagree with the subscription model. NSO was, and still is, notorious for some bad N64 emulation. Some seemingly simple effects like fog took weeks to iron out, and popular games like Ocarina of Time were aesthetically broken in many places. Now there's a concept. Other games like Pilot Wing 64 sometimes showcase the opposite problem. The game runs much faster than on real hardware simply because the timings for the emulated N64 are played so loosey-goosey that it isn't accurate to its source material. And even beyond all of that, the look and feel of the game still isn't quite right. HUD elements or 2D sprites tend to have this over-filtered look, which makes an already smudgy looking console look even more washed out. Now, most people would jump at the Big N's neck about all of this, and to be fair, their rage is, especially in the early months of the service, completely justified. But Playing devil's advocate for a moment, from a technical perspective, yeah, what else did you expect? Now, I could go on a 5-minute long expose on the history of N64 emulation and talk about high level versus low level, cycle accuracy, plugins, and all of that. But the gist of it is, N64 is a pain in the ass to emulate to this very day. And the Switch, what with its aged and downclocked mobile hardware, just wasn't going to give much breathing room for a very accurate N64 emulator. And all of this because the console itself is a notoriously difficult bastard to replicate. With all of that said, getting back to Goldeneye, the NSO N64 emulation isn't aiming for accuracy, but instead focused on getting it to play well enough on hardware not designed for it. Some, like Digital Foundry, have found glaring inaccuracies like bad texture filtering, that goddamn fog again, and just general loose approximations of the original experience. It would be nice if it was closer to the console, or at least match the accuracy of PC emulators with the newest plugins, but the Switch wasn't likely going to be the best way to play this game anyways. None of these setbacks are complete deal breakers though. Like, if you were to ask someone what their opinion was without putting the two versions side by side to compare, they wouldn't think anything of it. And that's fair if you don't mind the inaccuracies. They aren't all that harmful to the original experience. But if you're going to be paying an extra $30 perpetually for this version on Switch, maybe just good enough isn't what we should be settling for after waiting 25 years just to play this game again. But the NSO version does have support for online multiplayer, much like many of the other games on the service. The problem here is it's NSO Online. You can blame this nonsense on NSO still using peer-to-peer networking, where each player has to be in step with the other to maintain smooth gameplay. So if everyone's on fiber, but Sally down in Bubblefuck Jersey is still running on her parents' dial-up plan from back when Goldeneye first came out, she's going to be bringing the rest of them down with her. One of the other minor controversies surrounding the Switch release is how players have been responding to the controls. This is complicated because it gets into a greater discussion on the N64's controller and how, I would argue, it wasn't meant to be emulated at all. This stupid, genre-confused, trident machination of the 90s is one of the biggest pains to emulate. Not for any technical reason, but just how are you supposed to map this thing in the first place? Some games use the C buttons as a camera, like platformers, while others use them to mimic a 6-button control scheme. Some use the analog stick, others use the D-pad, and GoldenEye's control was never that great to begin with. We dealt with it simply because that's what we had, not because it was good. And if you're saying to use the dual controller schemes, no one back then did this. It's kind of the most obvious pitfall you run into when trying to get a game this old made for this kind of control scheme and contorting it to work on modern controllers. Are the Joy-Cons awkward to use for GoldenEye? Absolutely. But we're roughly 27 odd years past the point where this conversation realistically should have happened. Though maybe having a competent button remapping system like you already had on the Wii U would be nice, I guess. Without modifying the game itself, that's just a problem inherent to both of Rare shooters. Still, Nintendo could have done with making enough of their N64 replica controllers to compensate. But out of all the problems I have with this service, Control is the least of its faults. Actually, no it isn't. Because why are the main face buttons all wrong? It's not supposed to feel like a NES controller, it goes tilted the other way. Like the SNES Y and B buttons, your thumb's meant to rest on B and flatten on A, and the C down and C left buttons to the right. Why do they rotate it in the wrong direction? The C buttons don't make any sense this way. Why are you pressing the top button to look down? Who made this? That's just the Switch half of the discussion though. What about the Xbox release? Well, with these Series X and S being much more powerful consoles, while simultaneously bearing the most unfortunate acronyms whenever you try to shorten them, the Xbox version naturally should run better. I mean, the Series X is touted as the most powerful console on the market right now. It's an N64 game from 25 years ago. Like, it just has to be the definitive version. There's no way that it can be... Oh. 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 So, Code Mystics, what the hell is all of this? No, seriously, I want to know, because I wrote out this entire section of video. This whole part of the script here is dedicated to trying to defend your version as the closest thing to an ideal version of Goldeneye, because, MVG is just being too harsh, it's not really that bad. And what do I find? A whole recollection of some of my worst nightmares, apparently, because the Xbox version is just not very good. But before that, positives! Yeah, let's think positively here. The Xbox port of GE does introduce a new modern control scheme, which makes the game more accessible to players used to modern shooters. That's cool. Except when the aim lock option conflicts with the sniper scope, which are mapped to the same left stick. The frame rate is locked to 30 FPS, which isn't necessarily super ideal or anything, but the original barely ran at a quarter of that, so it's at least an improvement. Until it isn't, because there's massive frame pacing issues apparently. They said that the frame rate was to help mitigate engine bugs when running at higher FPS, but if that's the case, then what the fuck are all these new bugs then? And for some reason, the sound emulation is worse than listening on my actual tube TV? You'd think that, for a game that's well-renowned for its friggin' slap-happy soundtrack, where the bass plays a huge part of the atmosphere, getting the audio right would have been a priority. What is any of this? Like, I went into the Switch emulation knowing that it wasn't gonna be good. Like, haha, fuck go brrrr. The Switch is 8 years older hardware-wise and is less than an eighth the size. Like, yeah, what else did you expect? But Code Mystics, you're supposed to be the chosen ones! Well, so much for the compliments, I guess. But then, if this is supposed to be the baddest console of them all, then why does it have so many problems? Well, it's because that happens when you rely on emulation to port a game. Because some of these issues are, in fact, actually in the original. The seams and the Z-fighting are technically accurate because Goldeneye was never that polished a game to begin with. And rendering at resolutions beyond what TVs at the time could even display would of course bring out these rough edges on full display for everyone to notice. And then there's aspects like the firing rate for automatic weapons, which were in fact inconsistent at higher frame rates and may have been the victim to blame on the arbitrary 30 FPS cap. The thing is, when you're relying on emulation as a porting platform, you're effectively handicapped by short-sighted technical design choices made 2.5 decades ago. And the rare newbies who made this game at the time aren't to blame either. It's basically an industry practice to only develop things only as much as you absolutely need to for the hardware that you're working on. And unfortunately, when all you have is a glorified ROM file to work with, and without the source code to tell you what's what, you're left beholden to the limitations of the game's original bugs and the hardware that you're trying to replicate. Not without a lot of ROM hacking anyways, which, depending on the budget and deadlines, may as well be like finding needles in a really, really big haystack of ones and zeros.
Fine, then give me the ones.
I want the one.
And something tells me they weren't given enough of either. It's going to be real interesting the day a whistleblower comes out with all the war stories they have leading up to this launch, because you know that's probably a thing in today's age of modern gaming.
The game's already been delayed twice, they said. It's a big open world, no one's gonna notice a few glitches. Bethesda.
So, by some accounts, it is mostly accurate in the same way that a PS2 is accurate to a GameCube conversion of the same game, but with a set of controls, resolution, frame rate, sound, and bugs that weren't there back when it came out. It's really hard for me to give the XX version a recommendation, which is poetic because it's a lot of the same I could say for the NSO version as well. What with its inaccuracies, worse frame rate, and half-baked value adds, and the Xbox version having more game bugs, virtually no meaningful additions at all like online play, and pretty inexcusable performance on a system that should at least match what my $1,200 PC can do, both versions are pretty noticeably flawed. In the way that a normal person wouldn't notice these issues or hand-wave the problems they do have to age, thus misrepresenting what the original was meant to load and play. It's almost like these are ports with an identity crisis. And I can't help but feel reminded of Symphonia Remastered, which, it turns out, is somehow even worse than I originally predicted it to be. How does that even happen? Symphonia is a terrible port with a long and winding history of re-releases getting progressively worse with each console is pushed out to, which I've already documented extensively before. And these re-releases of Goldeneye also reveal their own issues that weren't in the original. So if that's the case, why aren't I raging as autistically over this old game that I was for that one? Is it favoritism? Bias? Salty that I didn't get the Xillia port I actually wanted? Okay, maybe it's that a little bit. But there's one important detail that changes everything, and justifies me even bringing this up again 2 videos in a row. Symphonia Remastered was a port that, I presume, uses some form of the original source code. They have all of the assets, the engine, the codebase. Everything to do with the game is laid out accessibly for them. And while porting games is never as easy as I might make it sound, they have the code and graphics laid out right in front of them to more easily adapt the game to run it on whatever target platform they want to run it on. In most cases, you don't have the overhead of emulation weighing you down that would noticeably reduce performance, because it's running natively on the hardware. That's what porting is. So when the game comes out and is missing graphical effects or unreasonably slows down in places where it never used to, despite it running at double the frame rate on a console 20 years older than it, there's less of an excuse. If you have the code, you can optimize it for the console. There was no good reason for why it should run worse, unless Namco's source code is so unreasonably hard to work with. But then if that's the case, why would it come out on 5 separate pieces of hardware? I swear this is the last time I'll bring this up. The point is, Bamco had the source code available for their game, but neither Code Mystics or Nintendo had the source of Goldeneye. And when you have a game that's so closely tied to a very particular piece of hardware in a form that's only made to run on a Nintendo 64, like an N64 ROM, the flexibility you have to make it run well is limited by how much more powerful your hardware is to that. This also requires having a competent emulator to make it work, so it's like a 2 to 3 step process of getting the game, emulating it, and then adapting it to feel natural on modern hardware. With that said, GoldenEye's ports aren't bad per se, but in a perfect world, they aren't exactly how I'd envisioned it either. Both versions have their flaws and value adds, so it really comes down to which piece of hardware you already have to run it. But then, if they cared so much about this release, why couldn't either company get a hold of the source code? Is it even still around? Well, kind of, but not in the way you'd expect. In the early years of the 360 era, there was one attempt at getting GoldenEye on Xbox Live. The appropriately named Project Bean is really exactly what we all wanted. The N64 Goldeneye on then modern hardware running at 60 FPS with optional remastered graphics had proposed online multiplayer with modernized controls for the 360 and is built off the original source code. The port itself was not only fully playable, but allegedly was something like 95% complete even. We were that close, they almost made literally what everyone was clamoring for more than a decade. They were right there, and true to its namesake, the source port was shot down at the last possible minute. And the best part about it is, the one who allegedly made the final call? Nintendo of Japan Satoru Iwata himself. The story's like poetry. It rhymes! But thankfully, we did eventually see the almost complete build leaked on the internet. Not only was it preserved, but the fans did what they do best and hacked the crap out of it to iron out some of the missing links in the prototype. It's even playable on both real hardware and on PC, but good luck trying to emulate a 360 today. It's still got a ways to go behind PS3 emulation. So if there was a native port being developed with all these new enhancements, why didn't they use that as the basis? Honestly, I've got not a clue, but I have a few theories. The original port was done by Rare, but being a Microsoft-owned entity, I've no idea if it was even possible to share if the idea was a simultaneous cross-platform release. It being a part of a Rare replay, it's possible that they wanted to keep parity with the rest of the games emulated in that collection, so they just decided to do the easier thing and hand the original ROM over, asking to patch out the Nintendo references and just work with that instead. It's also possible that Rare just couldn't be bothered to resurrect such an old project, or, going even further, pulled a Square Enix and simply lost the source code entirely. That last part isn't unusual in the games industry either. Kingdom Hearts also had its source code lost to time, so when the HD Remix Final Chapter whatevers were being made, they essentially had to rebuild the entire game from scratch, approximating the original look and feel as best as they could. With Goldeneye being 26 years old, it's possible that with technology, they found it was just easier to brute force it into working through emulation rather than having to unearth a potentially buggy source repository that's languished for 15 or so years.
It sure don't look friendly.
And as for Nintendo, that's an easy one. They probably just wanted something to bolster their online service. That said, I have to call them out on something. I'm getting the feeling that these versions coming out at the same time is being used as marketing for their respective platforms, more so than they are interested in preserving the original experience. Because the biggest flaw that's shared between both consoles is that it's only being released digitally. Nintendo Switch Online is, well, an online service. That service is wholly dependent on the big end providing the game to its subscriber base. The second that they decide that they can't host that ROM anymore for whatever reason, Bond's gone, even if the base service keeps trucking along without it. It's what I like to dub the Netflix problem. You're paying for convenience and not for ownership. Without hacking the app itself to inject your own games in an unofficial capacity, in which GoldenEye itself is just a glorified ROM and some emulator hacks, you don't have a choice if they can't host the game anymore. That's my personal beef with NSO as a whole. Even if the other emulators they provide are genuinely good, I just can't be sure for how long I'll get to keep hold of these experiences. And that isn't even to speak for if, or rather, when the service itself shuts down. Nothing ever runs indefinitely. Just ask Anthem fans how that's going for them. But then again, I'm just a loser hipster who runs Linux and plays certain games to the extent that it would drive the average person clinically f***ing insane.
Yeah, you wouldn't. My favorite GPU upgrade pitfall was when I got my 3060 Ti, and I didn't realize until after I put my whole system back together that I didn't have a display cable for it. No DVI connector? Hold on. A 3060 Ti? And you're running DVI? How are you still running DVI, bro?
I have a 3060. I'm not using a freaking DVI.
Right? I stopped using DVI years ago.
Yo! What kind of freaking monitor you got, bro?
That's what I'm saying, bro! I meant to upgrade my monitor forever ago, but gweh.
motherfucker got a CTE for the monitors.
Yeah. This motherfucker be using a goddamn CRT as his main computer monitor. This motherfucker still using S-Video. Knowing Seong, he probably would.
Oh man.
And I thought we had enough flashbacks already. Ugh. Still, you might be laughing, but who wouldn't want one of these as their main monitor? It weighs a ton, sure, but you'd be surprised how good these can still look. And, to top it all off, it has S-Video. Funny that. But I think I've made my point here already. Better. Still, I know I'm in the minority here, but I can't be the only person that has doubts about subscriptions and online services, right? Like, I'm not an insane person for noticing patterns in the game industry, right? The Xbox version, meanwhile, is on Game Pass, which is just another subscription service sharing many of the same problems, but it's also a digital add-on to Rare Replay, which, even if only in cyber form, it's at least in a tangible and preservable format. I know some people are adamant on physical preservation, and nothing against those types of people, even though it could be argued that physical media are glorified paperweights these days. But in my mind, both methods are virtually identical, just with different steps taken. Digital media can still be preserved just as easily as physical, and besides, you're probably not getting these games the same place you bought them from in 15 years from now anyways. If the publishers don't see it fit to keep these games accessible, then piracy is preservation, whether they want it to be or not. I'm also going to call bullshit that Steve Ballmersoft is only just now bringing out Goldeneye to the Xbox, but not the PC?
Can you believe it? No!
It's a first-person shooter to boot. That seems like the most obvious place to put it on. They've been committed to bringing out their games to Steam alongside Xbox, but somehow the biggest name in retro gaming, this mythological beast that's languished in licensing hell for 20 some odd years, they just don't deserve it?
Don't answer, or else...
Well, thankfully, as fans do as they've so done before, there is a solution to this. And no, not just emulation. Though you can always do that if you're like me and either don't have NSO or an Xbox. The Goldeneye decompilation is still a ways off from prime time, but we have the next best thing. And its name is 64. 1964. Using this, you can now play both the original Goldeneye and Perfect Dark the way mankind's dreamed of for years, with one of these. This version not only provides keyboard and mouse support, but also supports overclocking the emulated N64, so now you can run both games at frame rates even smoother than any console release. You can run the game at higher resolutions while maintaining an accurate look, and best of all, it supports not just Windows, but Linux desktop and Steam Deck through Wine, and it works just as well no matter the platform you play it on. You could make the argument, though, that the games were definitely not designed for these level of controls, and you're right. But I'm all for people playing their games however they want. Whether that's with a mouse or keyboard on PC, on their Xboxes or Switches, some elusive modded 360 with the updated prototype, or breaking out your original console and playing it on that, if you still have one anyways. Which brings us back to the question that I asked earlier. Which of these versions should you play? Which one's the best? And for once, it's hard to say. This one is an interesting case because each version has their own value adds and drawbacks. The N64 is the most authentic, but arguably the worst way to play and the least convenient. I mean, nothing against CRTs, but have you tried carrying one of these fucking things? The 360 remake was cancelled, but also unfinished, making it the least polished. The Switch version is portable and has online play, but is the most prone to issues because of its platform. And the XS release is a midlife crisis of a conversion. And right about here in the original script is where I would have gone the optimistic route by saying, the core experience holds up well enough regardless that you really can't go wrong with any of them. But I'm gonna be honest, while they're passable, I wouldn't be comfortable saying that I would play either of the official and currently only legal re-releases when there are at least 2 infinitely better versions elsewhere. I really don't want to be that one song. Being a killjoy about everything new that comes about in the gaming industry, but I like to think I'm here because I like talking about the games that brings me enjoyment, discussing what makes each one unique, and ultimately giving respect to games like Goldeneye as an art form. And like every other piece of art out there, books, music, movies.
You want it? It's yours, my friend, as long as you have enough.
Andrew!
They deserve to be preserved so people can experience them the same way as, or ideally, even better than how they were originally presented. And while me, you, and many other individuals are doing their own thankless jobs to show that respect to a beloved game that deserves better, Nintendo, Microsoft, MGM, and Eon aren't. And in their haste to rush Goldeneye out as a fashion statement for subscription services in the here for immediate profit now, they've left Bond to die for the foreseeable future. I'm not going to say for you to buy the ports, and I'm not going to say to pirate them either. But we should be asking for better. And if we don't get better, well, fans will just do as they've done time and again and carve out their own future. Wherever that will lead them, only time can tell. Jeez, what a sobering ending. And that is all I have to say about it. Thank you to everyone for sticking through the end. The viewership means a lot, even if I did get to this way later than I'd intended. Which version of Goldeneye did you play? Or were you like me and never even watched the movie it was based on? Comments mean engagement, so feel free to throw some in the box down below. I think you get the gist by now. As always, remember to show some love to the people around you, even if you disagree with them. And thanks for watching. Throw out all of that espionage and dual-wield Fuck. Throw out all the espionage and dual-wield Rocket. Why do I keep trying to say rocket launches? Ugh. Bond games were relegated exclusively to generic shooty-bang games once Activision bought the 007 license. And even the second big attempt at a GoldenEye reboot was literally a Call of Duty game in disguise. Which is how we were able to get Sin and Punishment after it languishing in Japanese exclusivity. Ooh, that was really bad. Implying Activision actually does something good in the gaming industry, which they obviously wouldn't dream of doing, but I'm trying to pretend here for the sake of argument. Implying Activision actually does something good in the gaming industry, which they obviously wouldn't dream of doing, but I'm trying to pretend here for the sake of argument. Just let us and justifies me even bringing it. Oh, it's so hot. Why does it have to be so hot today? And justifies me even bringing this up again 2 videos in a row. Fuck you, motorcycle. That was a really good take.